to this fabulous event, Riding the South. My name is Gunther Peck. I'm the director of the Hart Leadership Program. I see some of my current students, some former students. If I've never met you, you are absolutely welcome to be here. And we are delighted to have this event to talk with a real leader in the field of environmental journalism who has accomplished a great deal already, and I'm introduce Lyndsey just in a moment. But I would say this is going to be a forum that we want people to participate in. So the only caveat would be if you're making a question or asking a question, we would like to hear your name. And so it's not just don't remain anonymous. It's a big room, but if we can just say who you are and then ask your question when we get to that moment in the conversation. So Lyndsey Gilpin is the founder of Southerly, an independent and nonprofit news site covering the intersection of ecology, justice, and culture in the American South. I just want to pause. Ecology, justice, and culture in the American South. That's a really great combination right there, because that's not how the South is somehow necessarily thought of. In addition to publishing in-depth journalism, Southerly hosts forums in rural and underserved communities to learn what issues people want to see covered. Born and raised in Kentucky and now based in Durham, Gilpin is a reporter and editor who has covered climate change, energy, and environmental justice all over the United States. Her journalism is published in numerous outlets, including Harper's, Vice, The Daily Beast, CityLab, Undark, High Country News, FiveThirtyEight. I'm going to give the whole list. It's awesome. The Washington Post, Hakai, The Atlantic, Grist, Outside, and InsideClimate News. Now, if there's one you had not heard of before, your job is to follow up and check out that really new and interesting news site. She completed her undergraduate studies at the University of Louisville and has a master's degree from Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Lyndsey, and she'll begin by offering some comments, and then we will have some back and forth, and then open it up to the floor. Okay? So,
we just talk about.
Why don't you?
Start with the first question.
And I should say, Alyssa Cleveland is going to be joining us, and she's en route. Let me introduce her, even though she's not here, so I can get my introductions out of the way. She will be sitting in the chair that I'm going to be momentarily sitting, briefly sitting in. Alyssa is a senior studying environmental science from Atlanta, Georgia. She is interned at the Racial Carson Council, an environmental justice nonprofit in Washington, and the North Carolina League of Conservation Voters. She has also worked on a partnership project between the two Human Rights Center, the Franklin Humanities Institute, and the Alabama Center for Rural Enterprise on Environmental Justice in Lowndes County, Alabama. At Duke, she's the former editor-in-chief of The Bridge, a Duke and UNC collaborative student publication dedicated to content written by Black and Latino women. So I know she'll be here shortly. So I also wanted to say one other thing. For the folks here this came together as an event to think about environmental justice, but also to connect some of the ongoing energy in classrooms, but also between classes here at Duke and then a broader community about what environmental justice actually is. And even more importantly, connected to that, the challenge of how do you narrate it, and also a problem, I would say, that you can maybe respond to, which is that rural Americans, so-called, are the least likely to be environmentalists by designation. And yet they are also the closest to environmental change that is obviously reshaping our country and the planet itself. So there's a kind of paradox and a challenge and a problem with that we are mindful of and wanting to reflect on together, because there are interesting questions and answers to that problem as well. So part of it is about what stories we tell and how we listen. And one of the really exciting reasons we're here is to listen to how she has listened and learned. So I'm going to stop talking now and turn it over to Lyndsey, and we will I'll help facilitate. So,
cool.
Lyndsey.
Hi, y'all. Thanks for coming. This is awesome. I thought I was going to be asked a question first, so I'm just going to talk now. I'll talk a little bit about how Southerly started, who I am and how Southerly started, and then after that we can get into some more details about kind of journalism and justice and.
Can we turn the mic on?
Oh, is it not?
It's on, just louder.
Oh, just be louder? Okay, gotcha.
Sorry.
Got it. Okay, and so yeah, so I can get into all that, and I hope that you all ask a lot of questions just about journalism and about covering environmental issues and about the, all the change that is happening in this region as well. So I am from Louisville, like you just heard, and I decided I was going to be a journalist when I was 11 years old, like huge weirdo. And I wrote a memoir about my grandmother, who I never met, who was from Appalachia, from eastern Kentucky. And she died when my mom was really young. And I wrote a memoir and it appeared in the local newspaper in the kids section, which I didn't know at the time, in Louisville in the Courier-Journal. And so I saw my byline and I was like, oh gosh, this is what I want to do. I want to tell stories. And I say that because, not just because it's sort of a cute story, but because my interest in her was by extension an interest in Appalachia, where my roots were, and a place that I knew was rural and was misrepresented and that I didn't know a lot about but felt connected to kind of in my bones, which I think a lot of us have that connection somewhere with some land or some place in this region or wherever you're from. And so I kind of pursued journalism, and I went to U of L and was editor of the paper, and then went to grad school at Northwestern, where I got interested in environmental issues, mostly reporting on like the Chicago River and invasive species and kind of things like that. And I came back home and I wrote about technology for a while in Louisville, and sort of tried to write about renewable energy, but that did not get a lot of the clicks. So I made me write normal tech stories and like go to tech conferences and write about the valuations and like all the entirely too much money that's around that industry in Silicon Valley. And so after like a year and a half of that, I did this whole big soul-searching thing where I up and moved west because I thought that's where I could go report on the environment. And the idea was always that I would eventually come home, but I didn't realize that it would be this soon, to be honest. So I headed out west and I tried to freelance, and that didn't work because I was way too young and not connected. And then I landed at High Country News, which, if you don't know, is a magazine that covers the American West. So they talk a lot about tribal affairs, public lands, and climate change, everything. Sorry, still swimming. And that was 2016. So obviously it was during the presidential election. And I was watching, as many of y'all may remember, as the South was blanketed as a monolith and as Trump country, and sort of afterwards blamed for the results of the election. And reporters were parachuting in, from the New York Times, from the Washington Post, et cetera. And, they'd post up at a diner or at a gas station and like stick a microphone in somebody's face and ask them some question that like simplified all of these complex issues that are going on in our socially and economically and environmentally into a soundbite or quote, and that just didn't sit well with me. And so I started thinking about it, and it's not a new thing, right? Especially related to environmental issues. Like reporters have come in for years and years and years after a hurricane or after a coal ash spill or after the coal industry collapses and or coal company collapses, and they kind of get their story and have it written before they hit the ground, and then they leave and they don't come back. And that's led to a lot of distrust in the media, rightfully so, and that's led to a lot of misrepresentations of this region and of the people's connection to the land and their resources. And so I moved home after the election and decided to freelance and started writing about environmental issues in the South for all those places that you've named. And at the same time, I started Southerly as a newsletter. And so the idea was, are people interested in a publication like this? So I think I sent out a survey to like 50 of my friends or acquaintances, and I was like, and of course they were all like, yeah, for sure, start magazine. But I curated overlooked news that I was seeing. Like kind of looking at local news sites, was there a fish kill-off in a river because of a spill from a chemical company, or was there an energy company putting up a permit to build something that no one was paying attention to, and all the really good work happening with local journalists on the ground, and then great long-form journalism and sort of writing an editor's note about a timely topic, whatever that was, to try to distill information that's really complicated and abstract, like climate change and federal environmental policy, into into a kind of an accessible format in an email newsletter. And so I did that for a year, and it kept growing and growing. And as much as I will, during this discussion, hate on the New York Times, op-ed writer mentioned Southerly and a bunch of other really awesome Southern publications that are up and coming, and that helped grow for sure the newsletter subscriber base. So last year I launched it as an online publication with the idea that there's a huge gap in environmental coverage in the South, and I say that because of what I've mentioned with the national reporters coming in and parachuting. But also there's a local news crisis, as you all probably know, and there are many, many great reporters and news outlets on the ground that don't have the resources or the time or the money to put into reporting stories that maybe have to do with climate change or the environment. Also, there's all kinds of issues with politics in rural and small communities. And so the foundation of Southerly was built on how can we bridge that gap and reach people who aren't being reached or are being left out of the conversation. And so we launched with a series of stories on what you're just talking about, Lowndes County, Alabama, the lack of rural wastewater infrastructure in rural Alabama, and how that's led to a rise in hookworm in predominantly Black communities that are living, like they straight pipe their sewage into the ground because they can't afford septic tanks, and they're getting fined because they can't afford it, which is completely unfair, right? And so we partnered with Montgomery Advertiser, which is a local newspaper, and a freelancer who was in Alabama, who was from Alabama, and ran a series of stories. And I was writing a couple too. That was back when I had time to do that and to report. And so at the culmination of that series last fall, we held an event in rural Alabama and just got people in the same room to talk about this issue, which it was confusing and kind of entered town hall territory for a while. They're like, I didn't know how to handle. But it was really great because it was something that hadn't happened before. And there was a panel of an activist and a health department official and the reporter who was based in Montgomery and an engineer, and they all just talked about potential solutions and local solutions to this problem. And so that's sort of the model that I've used since then. So it is still a one-woman show, which is me. I am like the marketer and the fundraiser and the editor, and I have all kinds of wonderful pro bono help from friends and people I look up to in the industry, in journalism and in nonprofit world. But I have freelancers all over the region, which some of them are in this room. And so they're reporting stories, everything from how the agriculture industry is changing or how the seafood industry is changing to the health effects of coal ash in North Carolina near Charlotte and how that might be related to cancers or high rates of cancers in the area, to the decline of the coal industry in Appalachia. And so the idea has always been to grow sort of slowly and sustainably and pay people in a fair rate. That is not often the case in journalism, as many of you may know, and start to build up an authoritative voice on environmental justice issues in the South, but in a way that isn't beating people over the head about climate change, because to me that's really not effective at this point. And if we want to move the needle on climate change action or on how people are voting or on injustice, we have to reach people that don't get access to that information or don't maybe want to have that conversation because it's very complicated and abstract. And so that's sort of the model we've had. So we have a couple dozen stories and have partnered with local news outlets to tell those stories so that they're republishing it and printing it in rural newspapers and trying to reach more people. That helps me write to get Southerly out which is very hard with a new publication. And it also hopefully reaches people that, like I said, are left out of the conversation. So that was the short version.
So much rich material there. Alyssa? Do you want to come up and you've got some questions to ask? I have questions to ask,
yeah.
And I'm going to ask one before I finish my seat. So I'll kick off the questions and you can continue. The immediate question is, given the question of trust seems to be hard to articulate when you're dealing with people who maybe you're an outsider even if you're from the South. And I'm curious on the first Alabama story that you ran, how you both established credibility with people who didn't know you, so that they would feel like they were listened to and actually have their story heard. In fact, there's tension between following them and then telling the story, and I'm so curious about trust. So, but maybe you could, that's my question, and then I'll sit down and be quiet. So, come back to that.
Do we answer that?
One, you
I
answer
can
that.
answer that. Okay, I can answer that. It feeds into a lot of the other stuff we're talking about. So for that in particular, I think that the main thing was because Southerly was brand new, partnering with a local newspaper was huge for us. And that was a reporter who had often written about justice issues in rural Alabama, and it was something that she didn't have the chance to do very often because she was kind of confined to the grind of court reporting, et cetera, in Montgomery. And I think that helped. They promoted it in the newspaper. And then I had connections because I had actually written a story on this issue a year before, just as a freelancer, and I knew there was more there, and so that's why I chose it for this project that I got a grant through Southerly to do. And so I had built up trust in the community, and that's something that I think is important, especially and really giving the authority to the community, especially when it came to the event and to telling this story to them, because I am a white female reporter who just came into rural Alabama, and so I think allowing them to sort of help organize. So the main woman, Catherine Flowers, who has been kind of orchestrating this whole raising awareness about this issue, and also getting studies and actually Duke researchers to come in and study that sort of thing. Kind of getting in through that gatekeeper and then building trust in the community just by being there on the ground was incredibly important. And I think that's really hard with a new outlet. And there's no way around that. And there's no way around the fact that because it started as an email newsletter, I'm reaching a younger, more progressive audience. And so partnering and collaborating with local news outlets and trying to reach more rural audiences is the way that I see forward to actually kind of move past that, which is a lot of journalism sort of stops there. And I think that there's no way to move the needle on trust if you don't actually go out in the community, which obviously is hard. But I think it's the only way to fix this. Yeah.
So I actually had the opportunity to work with Catherine Flowers in her work with wastewater issues in Alabama in the communities you talk about. And she considers herself an activist. So do you consider your work in journalism to also be activism?
So to me, journalism it's a form of activism, but not necessarily in the way we think about activism, like going out and running an environmental organization or protesting in the streets. The best, most effective journalism results in some sort of change, right? That it results in a change in law, if that law is unjust, or a regulation change, if that regulation is unfair, or serving powerful interests that don't have people in mind. It changes somebody's opinion, maybe, or it changes their voting pattern, or at the very least, which still matters, it just maybe shifts someone's understanding of what's going on around them. And I think that is incredibly important to remember. The other thing is there's sort of this huge conversation around this right now, like journalism and activism. And there's this myth that journalists have to be objective and news stories have to be objective. And that myth is a myth because when that idea was created, there were white men in newsrooms. And there were white men telling the stories. And there were white men as the sources of those stories. And that's changing. And it's not anywhere where it needs to be, but it's changing. And that means that women and non-binary folks and people of color and LGBTQ people and others that feel oppression or are oppressed are telling the stories. And that doesn't make them necessarily activists or advocating for something because they are writing about what they're experiencing. There's a lot of great magazines and outlets out there that do great activist work and kind of have that agenda or that bent, and they produce wonderful stories. I don't think of Southerly specifically in that way, but I do think it's important to kind of see our role in everything that's going on around us, and that sort of gets lost sometimes. There's journalism is integral to democracy. And the problem is that I think we get so caught up in this, especially journalists, get so caught up in the conversation of, oh, like, what are we doing, what counts, what doesn't count, and like, what's activism and what's advocacy, and we like just talk around this, and instead of, and like, meanwhile, the institution of journalism is just eroding away, and that is like beneath our feet, and we don't really, or we're trying to fix it, but sometimes I think the conversation sort of gets lost. So that, also is a form of saving journalism is activism, and I guess it's activism. So I think it's just a really interesting conversation to have.
So you speak about the institution of journalism. What made you decide to create your own publication rather than using pathways that already existed?
Yeah. So we talked about this a little bit, but the national media often parachutes into places like the South, rural communities, and sort of has the story written and decides, what angle of that story to tell. And trust me, I tried to find a job that would let me work not in New York City or not on the West Coast. And even freelancing, I ran into a ton of problems with editors saying, they would like insert very small, seemingly small words or adjectives about the things I was writing about. Like I wrote a story about Appalachia, like health in Appalachia, and I was describing a place, and they just kept adding words like desolate and depressing, and I don't even know if they knew they were doing that, but it happened. And so I would, delete it and have a conversation about it. And then pitching stories was also sort of difficult where, I think it's getting better as we talk about these things more, but and that there's more journalists like in the middle of the country. But there's still sort of this idea. I remember I pitched a major magazine that I won't name about the water crisis in Appalachia. And we went through this whole thing for like 2 months, and she was like, this just isn't compelling enough. And I don't think the same thing would have been said if it was in San Francisco or New York City. And that happens a lot more often than I think a lot of people talk about. And so I decided to do the really easy thing, which is start your own magazine, which is ridiculous and so incredibly hard. But I don't, like I said, I don't see a way forward without newer, more innovative models of journalism, and also taking into account the importance of local journalism and regional journalism and the institutions that are there and that can be maybe not saved completely, but in some form they have to remain. So how do we do that? So I just decided to make my life a lot harder and start Southerly.
Yeah, so the way the South is talked about is often like a monolith, but the issues are very vast, and the South is a big area. So how do you pick which issues you report about, and how do you make sure that the stories connect to one another?
Yeah, that's a good question, because the South is huge. So Southerly covers 12 states. So basically up through West Virginia, down through Florida, over through the coastal Louisiana and up through Arkansas, and the eastern coast, eastern Texas, basically, I include. I try not to tackle all of Texas right now, and they have lots of media. And then eventually I'd like to cover Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, because that, especially as the climate changes, that is part of the South, and part of a lot of the justice conversations and environmental conversations about the South. And so, like you said, within that, that's a huge area. You have Appalachia, you have the Mississippi Delta, you have the Gulf Coast, you have Florida on its own, you have the Mid-South, and the Atlantic coast. And so there's all kinds of issues, and they're all facing sort of different challenges with whatever their economy is. But the biggest thing that I see is that we often talk about all of these regions sort of in silos, but what Appalachia is facing with the decline of the coal industry is very similar to what farmers in Arkansas or Georgia are facing with the agriculture industry and the monopoly of the agriculture industry, or what the oil and gas workers are dealing with the oil and gas industry, especially offshore drilling. And drawing those connections is really important to me, because, and I think a regional magazine is very well positioned to do that. It can do that in a way that the national media can't or won't, And it can do that in a way that local news doesn't, or local news outlets don't have, the resources to or don't need to because of their audience. And so, when I think about stories for Southerly, when I accept pitches or when I look for stories, it focuses in on a community because that's the way to talk about what all these complicated issues, whether it's climate change or or flooding or the changes in the ag industry or federal policy. It's easier for people to digest, as many of you probably know if you're journalism students, that if it starts out really small and then talks about somebody's family or just or their business or whatever it is. And Southerly stories also bring the context of the rest of the South so that people don't think that their problem is isolated. And I think that's incredibly important because the people in political and economic power in this region and in this country like us to feel isolated in our problems, like people in rural communities and underserved communities and vulnerable communities to feel isolated and like they can't fight back. That's why a lot of, you see a lot of industrial sites or pipelines or mines put in these places, right? And so if we can connect the dots more and show that that people aren't alone and that they're facing similar issues. Of course, they manifest differently, but that they're related. I think that can go a long way in sort of understanding where other people are coming from. And the other thing is that like one example is the Catherine Flowers in Lowndes County. Just like I was reporting on this last summer or spring. And she had just started talking to people in eastern Kentucky, in Martin County, where there's been a water crisis for a long time with contaminated drinking water. And they were on the phone while I was there talking and about just water issues in general. And I thought that was so amazing because that hadn't happened, and they've both been facing these battles alone for so long. And it was just really great to see that those conversations were occurring. The same along the Atlantic. I've been reporting on the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, and communities in North Carolina are now talking to those in West Virginia. And that it took a long time for that to happen, but that I think is just integral to sort of understanding this really confusing and complex place that we live.
And how have you seen that the history of the South and its power structures impact environmental issues in this region in a way that's distinct from other places in the country?
So every story about the South is about its history and slavery and Jim Crow and so the civil rights movement. It's about resource extraction and wealth extraction from Appalachia or the Delta or wherever it is. And the South's history is violent and it's unjust, and our identity, the identity of the region, is complicated and contradictory and confusing, and it's very hard to understand sometimes and to wrestle with that just in general as a human and also in journalism. There's also this sort of when we talk about the South in relationship to the land and to the environment. It's sort of the narrative that Southerners don't have a deep connection to, at least what I've seen, that Southerners don't have a deep connection to the environment because, like they would out west, where there's all kinds of public land and all kinds of protected spaces. That because there's little protected land here. That like we don't care about the outdoors as much, or we don't care about protecting the Appalachian Mountains as much, and that's a false narrative. There are so many people. Obviously, everyone has a connection, like I said in the beginning, to the places they live. But I think there's a lot of stories to be told there that are sort of kind of lying in the background about how complex our relationship is to our natural resources and our land here. And that goes all the way back to I think a lot lately about, because of Indigenous Peoples Day yesterday, Native American issues in the South are often ignored. And that's because there are very few federally recognized tribes in the South, right? And that means less resources for them to preserve their land or their resources or their cultural sites. And so oftentimes when we think about Native American issues, it's out west. And so all of those things, I think, the history of how this region has changed and looking forward, how that can all be repeated, or at least happen in a similar way as the climate changes, because it's going to affect low-income people and people of color first, and is affecting them first. The most vulnerable people, like people in places, along the coast, etc. That can repeat itself, and that's where journalism comes in and storytelling comes in, and I think that's really important in not just in Southerly stories, but just in storytelling in general about this region.
And then with climate change being such an issue that's talked about in the political sphere, how have you seen how the communities you work with think about this issue? Whether they believe in it, buy into it, what have you seen?
Yeah, that's a good question. I get this question a lot because I've been speaking a lot lately, and that I was actually at a panel at this conference over the weekend in Colorado with environmental journalists, and one of the topics was on anger and grief around climate change. And there was somebody from the Houston Chronicle on there, and there was a national journalist on the panel, and they disagreed a lot on how to approach climate change for their audiences, and it was actually a really thoughtful conversation that I hope that we all have more often. Yes, it is true that the people in power, whether it's state lawmakers or governors or senators or the federal, the presidential administration, and particularly in state governments in the South, are holding the region back on climate action, on renewable energy, on environmental justice. Like, that is a fact. But that also doesn't mean necessarily that everyone in the region is. And I think that oftentimes that's how it's seen, is because they voted for this person, that means they don't want action. And every year you see stories about the percentage of people that believe in climate change. It's like the needle moved just a tiny bit, so it's like 65% instead of 60%, and that's just, it goes around the internet every year, and it's always about this region or the Midwest, just the middle of the country in general, about who believes in what and why they don't, and why they shouldn't be voting, blah. There's all of this conversation, and it's so frustrating to me because and some people will probably get mad at me for saying this, but it doesn't matter. Like, it really doesn't matter if people are, like, what that percentage is, because it's happening and people know it's happening. And more than that, oftentimes, much of the time, folks like farmers or coal miners or just random people that don't feel like engaging in a political debate don't want to talk about climate change because it's confusing and it's abstract and it's scary. But they will talk about how their home has been flooded because of a landslide down a mountainside that was mined, or how, in the Mississippi Delta, we ran a story today on the flooding in the Mississippi Delta this year. I mean, many farmers just didn't plant crops all year because it was just a historic flood for months and months and months. And so people will talk about that. They'll talk about how these problems are affecting their bank accounts or their families or their health, and in a way that they won't engage necessarily. If you just ask them about the Green New Deal or the Clean Power Plan, and those are really important policies and ideas that we're going to have to talk about, right? But especially with media, we don't have to do it in a way that beats people over the head with statistics. Or tries to guilt them into action, because that's not the way that I see moving forward. That conversation is going to go well, and I think we're sort of all wrestling with this idea, and that's where local news and regional news comes in handy. Is that despite all the distrust in media, most people still watch their local TV every day, or read their newspaper, or look at Twitter, and that's a way that by telling stories about those things that I just talked about, the local impacts of climate change, and how that intersects with health and business and insurance and all of these things that that are intertwined, but we often talk about climate change like over here, this thing that we're going to have to deal with eventually. The more we do that, the more I think that people can understand and kind of demystify around what it looks like and make it less terrifying for people. And like in that way, they might not dig in their heels as much on some of these issues.
And it's so interesting, the idea that people in the South don't believe in climate change, because North Carolina is actually the birthplace of the environmental justice movement. and which has a lot of principles about how to transition to a future that's sustainable but also includes all groups of people. So what do you see as the solutions to reach a future that takes into account protecting the environment but also includes all people?
Okay, I knew she was going to ask this question. I thought about it all day, and I wish I knew the answer. I would probably be paying myself right now with Southerly and not freelancing on the side if I knew the answer to this question. But I think so. What I operate under, the framework I operate under, just as a human and as a journalist, is that we are. No matter if we stopped carbon emissions right now, we still will have effects from climate change, right? No matter if we just up and got rid of all of our terrible things about our political systems right now, we would still have the effects and the scars and the legacy of like everything of capitalism and of like systemic racism and all of these things that have been built into this country and this world and our framework. And that's scary, right? So that doesn't sound like a solution. But there are ways within that we can find injustice and shed light on injustice and also find beauty. And I hope that doesn't sound too, Pollyanna of me, but like, I really think it's important to think about those two things because it's happening on the ground level. Of course, we all, most of us, I imagine, want clean energy and affordable clean energy, or we want clean air and clean water and clean soil. We want reparations for African Americans and for Native Americans, and justice for and safe spaces for people that come into this country, or for people who are oppressed. And that's that to me that's important. And I think that and I think most people want that, but. Those are huge things to tackle, and the solutions that I see and that I believe in are happening sort of in whatever corner of the world people are in, working towards those goals, right? And so you see, small communities adapting to climate change and sort of like helping each other out after a hurricane, or kind of doing flood buyout programs, or elevating their homes, or like large programs to get a tribe on the coast to move inland. And that comes with its own host of problems. Like every solution, I feel like, comes with its own host of problems. But those sorts of things kind of move us in the direction of a more just and equitable world. And the biggest thing, I think, is that people have access. It starts with journalism. Like, it starts with access to information. And it starts with a way to get, whether it's the actual, literally the internet, getting to people to reach that information, or just making sure that voices that are underrepresented or undervalued are heard. And I think that is the starting point, because if we don't kind of understand what other people are going through and start to build back up the trust, we can't fix it, right? But to build back up the trust in this time when it's incredibly urgent to do so, and also in a time where this situation is just going to get worse if we don't address it. I think building that back up is really important, and that starts with information and with listening to people. So that's sort of like how I do it, is like how some people do it is protesting and activism, and how I do it lately is Southerly. And I think that is just like one way that in my corner I can work towards solutions. So.
And then before I open the floor for questions from the audience, do you have any final words about the work you're doing, or advice for young journalists or activists?
Oh, yeah. Don't work for free. I say this everywhere I go. Do not work for free. You don't have to work for free. Especially women, do not work for free. You don't need to do that to make it in the journalism world. You also don't need to kind of follow a linear path. We've all sort of bounced around, and I think that's really important. So I'm happy to answer more questions about that. As far as Southerly, we are growing, and also there's a newsletter sign-up sheet out front, and so if you do that, you don't have to go online and sign up. I can just sign you up. So please sign up. It comes out every Thursday. So we have the newsletter that I talked about that this all grew out of. I still send out every Thursday. along with publishing stories on our website. And if you ever have feedback or ideas or story ideas or pitches or whatever it is, please don't hesitate to reach out to me because I want more voices and I know you all have thoughts on all of this stuff. So I'm always happy to hear feedback. But thanks for listening to me.
Yeah, thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
So are there any questions from the audience? And once you speak, could you stand up and project your voice, please, so we can all hear?
Hi, I'm Cameron, an aspiring environmental journalist. So thank you for everything you said. I have two questions. Number one, does Southerly have an internship that I could apply to? And number two, you kind of touched on this a little bit, but I was wondering, environmental issues today are, as you said, super daunting and just sad, depressing. I was wondering how you try to balance out the success stories and the happy times that come along with environmental justice or environmental issues in general, and do you feel there's even a need to do that? Is it more important to just give people the truth, give people the facts that this is happening and it's growing into an issue, or do you try to balance out the happy time?
Yeah, that's a good question. So on the internship point, I want to do that eventually, so I'm working towards that. So I will let you know if I get that in order. But on the second question, so this is something I think about a lot because, we talk about, sometimes when we talk about, there's this whole thing called solutions journalism now. And I think it gets a bad rap sometimes because it's like you're a fluff piece or you're just going out and reporting on the good things and ignoring all the real stuff that's going on. But in reality, it's just good journalism. It's just how people are responding to problems. And I think that is a way into climate conversations or conversations about climate change, about environmental regulation and things like that, because if you can help people understand just how someone is addressing it, even if it's on the smallest scale, even if it doesn't work, whether that's sort of like we had a story on the next generation of fishermen along the Gulf Coast are adapting to the problems they're seeing with the oyster industry because of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill and also because of the changing salinity levels and temperature of the Gulf of Mexico. They're doing aquaculture farms where they're growing their own oysters and like selling them in high-end restaurants, and their parents have been kind of put off by that at first, but they're starting to make at least sustaining themselves halfway, like they're still doing commercial fishing. But that is a story that is about climate change, right? But is also about solutions. We also had a piece recently on the fact that in Houston there was a historic African American cemetery that is eroding and flooding a lot, especially recently. And we looked at sort of the broader issue of the lack of resources for African American landmarks across the South, historic and cultural sites, and the kind of this campaign to put a bunch of money to get these places on the National Register that is sort of up and coming. And also, that's not going to solve all the problems, right? We'll probably still lose some sites, unfortunately, but it is a response. And so I think telling those stories, while also being realistic about what's happening, is probably the most effective way to go about it. We still tell the truth about, climate change, or it's raining more, or it's flooding more in the Southeast, while making sure that people understand that all hope is not lost, because it isn't. And I think that's really important. The other, sort of just quickly, the other point on that is engaging with people after the story. And so we do this, I totally forgot to talk about this, but we host events around the region, especially in rural areas, to get people talking about not just environmental issues, but how media works and how what off the record means and how you get data from how a journalist goes out and gets data or calls their county commissioner 100 times and never gets a call back. And that ties in, I think, really strongly with helping people understand what, not just how the media works, but also what environmental stories are, what kind of how complicated all of these issues are, and speaks to them in a way that we just get them in the same room and talk about what they want to see, because they often want to see solutions. stories about what's working, and they're just kind of tired. People are tired of depressing news, and that's always been a thing. That's not anything new, but there's some truth to that, and I think that if we listen to people, literally like in their one-on-one, in person, on the ground, then and let them tell their own stories and give their own ideas, then we can gain a lot from that instead of just throwing information out there and hoping it sticks.
Hi, my name is Olivia No. I actually work with a couple of professors here at this university in the Vast Connections, where we do research on coal in America, like in particular in Appalachia. So I feel like recently we've noticed a bit of like an increasing trend of even in research that we're reading, especially modern research, extremely modern in the last 2-3 years, that there's almost a tone of condescension, in particular towards the war on coal, like the regulatory war on coal narrative. And I was wondering if you could provide any insight as to, where this condescension came from, and kind of why it persists, even though, we've seen that, politically, the construction of the South is full of ignorant rednecks monolith is actually extremely ineffective in reducing polarization.
Yeah. That's really that's really great research and a good question. I think the condescending tones particularly towards coal communities. That's the story. That's the easy story, right? It's way easier to go into a place and operate off of the narrative that has been told for decades and decades. That it's hopeless and that there's nothing there and that there's no ideas there, and that that everyone's just okay with that. Like, that is a much easier way to tell stories and to also kind of research or make laws and regulations than doing the hard work of understanding the complexities in those places. And I'm sure you're seeing this a ton, but there's people kind of very conflicting views in coal country. For instance, they're dealing with black lung disease. Former miners are, like this resurgence of black lung disease. 1 in 5 miners in Central Appalachia is suffocating and dying from black lung disease, and yet some of them still vote Republican, right? And if you were an outsider looking in, you would say, and most people do say, like, oh, that doesn't make any sense. Like, it just doesn't. Why would you do that? That's your fault. And there's comments all the time on stories I've written and other stories about Appalachia and other places like it that, like, you deserve it. You voted for that, it's your fault. And that doesn't take into account the systems of power, not just Mitch McConnell, but all kinds of other long-standing lawmakers and trusted people in the communities that have sort of orchestrated this narrative that you don't have another choice. Coal is coming back. This is the regulation's fault. And yes, regulation you will lose some jobs because of that, but it also doesn't. No one in that narrative ever takes it a step farther to say what's next. And I think that's often where the conversation stops, is right there, is there's nothing left, and then it's dying. And, until we start to talk about what's next, whether that's legally, like introducing laws about economic development and like mine restoration, or just in storytelling, looking at solutions to, what miners are doing now. And it's not a catch-all like, we're going to build a solar farm and it'll be fine, which is also the narrative that happens. And that's frustrating too, because an industrial park is not going to solve the problem. Like $30 million investing in an industrial park by the governor of Kentucky is not going to fix the lack of jobs in Appalachia, and neither is a solar farm. And so I think kind of digging into those issues and realizing that people are incredibly complicated, and that the issue, especially of coal in Appalachia, is incredibly complicated, is the only way to kind of fight that narrative. But it's much easier not to.
Hi. Okay. Hi, I'm Charlie. I'm a sophomore. I'm interested in journalism, especially in the American and global South. And Lyndsey, I just wanted to thank you for bringing up the truth, essentially, that a lot of times there is an alienation between especially national news and local communities. I think it's not just an alienation that comes from maybe we're using terms like climate change that are scary and abstract, but I think there is also a sense that we don't really prioritize learning about the stories and the history of communities that policymakers and coastal elites don't care about people's heritage, and they don't understand that maybe people defending coal aren't just defending jobs, but also their heritage. So I really appreciate that outlets like Southerly are trying to be more responsible in the way that they engage with local communities. At the same time, I'm wondering, what do you think of the role that local journalism or regional magazines like Southerly could play in bringing these stories and this knowledge about history and heritage out to people living in other parts of the country, especially people who might not usually read magazines like Southerly or local news in parts of the South?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. So I think about this a lot because Southerly is for people living and working in the South, and primarily, right? And it's, like I said, to reach people in this region that don't often have access to stories that we produce about the environment. But at the same time, and this is something that I sort of wrestle with a lot, is what, I also want people outside of the region to read it. And oftentimes they do, and it's still a lot of journalists reading it, and it's still a lot of people that moved away from the South when they were younger and just were kind of resentful of it for a long time. And I get people emailing me all the time, which is really heartening, that they just sort of wrote off Alabama or wherever they were from, and then after reading the newsletter consistently or reading the story, they sort of understood that place better. And I think that's sort of a small victory. And I've partnered with Southerly's partnered with National Climate Central, which produces climate change data nationally, with one of their reporters to do a story in conjunction with a local news outlet. And I think that I've talked a lot about partnerships with local news, but I think eventually, I get a lot of calls from the New York Times and others to be like, what's going on with environmental reporting in the South? Can you tell us why it's so crappy? And it's like, well, that's not really the thing. Our problem is that the way we cover these issues nationally and even globally is not great. We were a little late to the game on a lot of it, and so we're trying to play catch up. And so just national outlets, I sort of I feel like I've just become this middle person of sorts, where it's like, since it's regional, it's like, can you help explain these small communities to us? And I can't do that, right? Because I also can parachute in somewhere if I don't know it. But I think helping national reporters and sort of calling that out continuously is really important. And that oftentimes means me yelling on Twitter. But sometimes it means sending an email about a story, or trying to help someone understand that is a stereotypical thing to say. And it comes down to reporters coming back, whether it's home or just being in the middle of the country and reporting from places that aren't in New York or on the coast. And that is kind of frustrating to me, because it puts it on us to go find those jobs, which don't exist most of the time. So it's the industries, it's sort of like an industry level shift that has to happen for that to even change, because that would mean that they offer jobs in those places. And if they don't offer jobs in there, you have more funding for local news outlets and for regional magazines and for people, freelancers, et cetera, who are in the places that they're writing about. And that's a huge ask, and I don't really feel super confident about that. but I think it's important to kind of work towards that goal. And in the meantime, sort of call it out when you see it. Yeah. Either one, keep going.
Hi, I'm Sam, and I'm just wondering how you frame inter-community conflict in a way that humanizes the multi-side issues.
Yeah. So I think there's, especially around environmental stories, there's often, in kind of traditional reporting, there's often you have to talk to both sides of the story, right? And there's sort of this false balance thing that got us into this whole climate change mess in the first place. And there's a difference between doing that and also just hearing the perspective of a variety of stakeholders in the community. And so in every story, you always have to, always talk to whoever cares about it. So whether it's the activist that cares about it, and it's also the county commissioner or the city council person that cares, that is on the other side of it, that's introducing, some permit for a project or something. And, you bring in sort of the context from a researcher or an expert that can also weigh in on that, not just that specific issue, but sort of contextualize it to show kind of what's at stake there. And I think that's a really difficult thing to do, and it takes a lot more effort and energy to talk to more people and to kind of understand sort of the nuances of how in one particular community people relate to each other. And that's hard. It's a hard thing to do, but that to me is sort of the best journalism that I see, and that I try to do most of the time. And oftentimes you'll never get all of the perspectives. You'll never make a community perfectly happy with any story. And I think that's important to remember too. But you can kind of go to whatever links are possible to get that. I hope that helps.
We have time for one more question.
Recently, I've been doing a little bit of reading about I'm Allison. Hi. Recently, I've done a little bit of reading and encountered stuff about the Duke Energy monopoly, and I was curious if you've encountered that at all in your work with Southerly, and what your thoughts are on kind of how Duke students relate to Duke Energy, and what you hope to see the future of that monopoly.
So I didn't know that. I was always interested in the history of Duke University and Duke Energy. I never knew that until I moved here a couple months ago and took a tour of this university. And I was like, oh wow, that's crazy. That's a long history. And I think that utility monopolies are really interesting right now because no one talks about utilities because they think they're boring, and sometimes they are. But really, that is sort of the future of what not just this region, but this country is going to look like. And it's the same, in every other industry where you have a monopoly of a few companies. And Duke Energy is, just like Dominion Energy in Virginia, has a monopoly on the state and on almost everyone's power. And that's a really kind of looking at and examining power structures. I think that utilities are the really interesting and effective way to understand power structures especially this area of the country. And so I don't know if this happens every few years or what. Maybe people who are a long time North Carolinians can tell me. But it sort of seems like there's more awareness around these monopolies and kind of breaking them up. I don't know how effective that will be, but it is cool to see that happening.
Join me in thanking Alyssa and thank the DeWitt Wallace Center for Media and Democracy for co-sponsoring this event. And I encourage you to stay and ask more questions. There is food that needs to be consumed, not wasted. Thanks so much.
Thanks for coming.